While the COVID pandemic we've all lived through did certainly unleash a turbulent period for our education institutions and our student community, including the challenges of the digital divide, which came up with online education, uncertainty surrounding examinations, learning outcome losses. We've gone through this whole list. We know that not all that currently ails our universities and our students has been a byproduct of the pandemic alone. But there is no denying that existing problems, the global trend in slashing state support for universities, reduced allocations for research and innovation, and the quality of output being produced, the over-bureaucratization of academia and the quality of what is coming out, the over-regulation of campuses. We are by and large over-regulated and under-resourced, and I think that is very clearly a problem that afflicts all universities across India. And of course, the growing threats to the freedom of academic expression. All of these are likely to spike considerably if we are not able to find answers to these challenges today. Now, the idea of a university is a phrase which, as Father Vinayak has already pointed out, is most famously associated with the 2-volume collection of essays with that title by Cardinal John Henry Newman that were first published in 1852. The idea of a university in which teaching and research were combined in the search for impartial truth reached classic form in 19th century Germany, associated with the famous Humboldt model, which became the dominant global model of a university, a place with intellectual and academic freedom, university autonomy, the growth of independent disciplines with their own standards and priorities, and increasing internationalism. This was the model that Newman arguably had in mind when he wrote the idea of a university. But don't forget that Cardinal Newman was primarily speaking of religious education, and though he was doing that, he showed remarkable foresight in articulating the concept of the modern-day university as an intellectual and liberal engine for contemporary society, intended to serve as a haven for a community of thinkers for whom the cultivation of the intellect could be reasonably pursued for its own sake. And the for its own sake are a vital part of his words. Even more than a century and a half later, his powerful arguments for the value of a liberal education and the principal duties of a university are well worth reminding ourselves of today. To Cardinal Newman, the purpose of education was not to be merely preoccupied with the gathering of knowledge, wisdom, or even scientific temper, that phrase from our Constitution, but one that was motivated by the cultivation of the intellect and a universal knowledge that aided the enlargement of the mind or illumination. I'm using his words. What would this imply for a university? To quote the Cardinal in his own words again, he believed that as a matter of history, the business of a university is to make this intellectual culture its direct scope, or to employ itself in the education of the intellect, just as the work of a hospital lies in healing the sick or the wounded, or a riding or fencing school, or of a gymnasium in exercising the limbs, or an almshouse in aiding and solacing the old, of an orphanage in protecting innocence, of a penitentiary in restoring the guilty. So just that those are the core functions of those institutions, Newman felt that a university's job was to cultivate the intellect. Now, this departure from the utilitarian view of education as a means of economic and social progress has faced criticism. Newman's essays emerged in an era when universities were largely accessible only to those with social, political, or evangelical capital, predominantly the gentry or the church. In India, too, the finest universities, still aligned with the traditional Newman idea, are often perceived as bastions of social privilege, detached from economic and employment realities. Newman's vision also excludes polytechnics or vocational education. In fact, critics have noted that he offers little guidance on striking a balance between the pursuit of knowledge and equipping students with practical, employable skills. Nor does he address the fundamental issue of how such an enterprise should be financed, an omission that underscores his limitations as, in the words of a critic, the ultimate ivory tower dweller. Increasingly, demands for research to be economically and socially relevant, to help students find work in the real world, have challenged the classic Newman view of untrammeled academic freedom and the cultivation of the intellect. What policy should be pursued to preserve democratic access to the best higher education and to match individual talent to intellectual aspirations as well as societal needs? Universities juggle demands for credentials, skills, and innovation, but remain rooted in their traditional role, engaging with values, culture, and politics, rather than caring about the market. To be, in short, the ivory towers of intellectualism that are increasingly disdained by hard-headed employers. Now, for most families in India, these utilitarian concerns are realities that we are particularly familiar with. Perhaps more so because the fact is that in our country, our educational system has historically served as a beacon of hope in a tumultuous world for millions, even if arguably the system in itself has not yet become our greatest glory. It is, of course, imperative to remember our humble beginnings on the eve of Indian independence. Britain's crippling and debilitating colonial rule left us with only 16% literacy at the time of independence, barely 30 universities in the entire country, about 700 colleges, and a total enrollment of just 4 lakh students in the entire country. While India struggled for the next 5 decades as the poorest, most illiterate, the most malnourished, and the least gender-sensitive major country in the world, with over half the world's illiterate adults and 40% of the world's out-of-school children residing in our country, the trajectory of our purpose to the trajectory of our progress to our present state is remarkable. What our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, brought to this was a certain vision and relentless efforts, and we embarked on an educational revolution, building a vast system that nurtured scientific and technological excellence, deep humanist thought, and boundless creativity. When I came into government, unfortunately for a very brief while as the Minister for Education, I found the initial catechism in our education policy that dominated our higher education system were 2 E's, expansion and equity. Expansion in the number of institutions and equitable access to them for those who had previously been denied educational opportunities because of their caste, their gender, their religion, their region, their tribal status, whatever. In the process, perhaps we didn't give enough attention to the 3rd E in the catechism, which was excellence. I then added a 4th E as minister, and that's endured, I gather, amongst my successors, and that is the E of employability. And I'll come back to this larger theme in a minute. Now, there have been shining exceptions, of course, to the complaint about lack of excellence. There's no question that today's Americans speak about IITs with the same reverence they accord to MIT. The image of India has changed from that of a backward developing country to a sophisticated land that produces engineers and computer experts. The old stereotype of Indians as one of snake charmers and sadhus. Now it's changed so much that I was accosted by an anxiously perspiring European at an airport in Europe, Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, saying, "Oh, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop?" I mean, the entire thinking now is that every Indian must be a software guru or a computer geek. Now, in 2025, when I look back on my days as a young graduate, I think of how few were the options available to us as college students in the 1960s and 70s, as compared to the plethora of opportunities presented to graduating youngsters nowadays. Wider options to study, wider employment opportunities to prepare ourselves for, and especially in higher education, there are many more subjects available to pursue and courses that never existed during my college days, as well as on-campus recruitments from companies and from professions that had not even been dreamt of in my youth. Evolution means that India must keep up with the world. The IITs have now launched certificate programs in artificial intelligence and machine learning. One has already set up a center for artificial intelligence. These will mushroom in the years ahead. At its very foundation, our Prime Minister, Nehru, had called IITs India's future in the making. And now young professionals from these institutes are indeed making global history. Young professionals with IIT degrees. But we still have a long way to go with that fourth E I mentioned, employability. To meet the forces of the markets, the demands of research, the pursuit of usable knowledge, and the imperative of building an equitable society. We're suffering from a systemic problem of a skill mismatch between the qualifications we're giving our children and the jobs available for them to undertake. The skill mismatch has seen some improvement in certain sectors over time, but chronic problems persist. I remember reading with horror not too long ago about the Madhya Pradesh Police Department advertising 14,000 constable posts, which required an 8th grade pass, 8th standard pass. The department advertised 14,000 posts. They got 9 lakh applicants for these 14,000 jobs. Among them were nearly 10,000 engineering graduates and a dozen PhD holders, plus 1,90,000 graduates and 15,000 postgraduates. And this is, as I say, a job of a constable with a minimal school education required. There are similar anecdotes you can find about every menial job advertised by the railways, the state and central governments, the public sector undertakings. Why? Because we are releasing graduates into an ecosystem that does not know how to use them. They settle for a constable post as an alternative to frying pakoras, as some who ought to know better have advised them to do. Therefore, even as I speak to you today as someone who has benefited from a liberal education, right from my schooling throughout my university years, I recognize the natural inclination in India to make higher education more utilitarian, to align it with the demands of what we hope will once again be a rapidly growing economy in a globalizing world. Given the record high unemployment assailing our country, sluggish economic growth, and the lasting impact of the Trump tariffs, there is a compelling case for equipping graduates to navigate an increasingly challenging job market while strengthening long-term resilience. After all, a university graduate employed in a stable profession was undoubtedly better positioned during the pandemic, for example, than an artist, an actor, or a scholar of 18th century poetry. While the concern is valid and one I fully understand, I would argue that the fundamental aim of higher education, particularly liberal education, is to equip graduates for any profession they may enter. As I've often noted in discussions with our engineering institutions, India produces approximately 1.5 million engineering graduates each year. About 60% of them actively seek employment, but not all of them meet industry standards in terms of readiness. Simply put, if we focus entirely on subjects like engineering because we think that'll help them get jobs, we are wrong. Associations like the CII, ASSOCHAM, FICCI, have found that most of our engineering graduates are not ready for the marketplace. And what is worse is what happens afterwards. The organization that I conceived and led for 6 years in the Congress Party, the All India Professionals Congress, conducted a survey amongst 10 or 20,000 Kerala engineering graduates. And they found that 66% of them were doing jobs that did not require an engineering degree. That is the situation we are unleashing our engineers to. Either they know things that are not relevant to the marketplace, or what they know is not required by employers, and as a result, they have to essentially cast aside the discipline they have learned to do other kinds of work.